Right, so now on to our second part of the respiratory system. Okay, so this second part can be a little challenging to understand, but I will go through it in the lab as well. Okay, so over here, respiratory areas, what this refers to are that we have these neurons in our brain that control breathing. So that's really what the second part of this chapter is about. It's about regulating breathing. These respiratory areas in our brain activate breathing muscles and adjust the rate and depth of breathing. Main respiratory areas. So here, let's put some notes over here. Middle respiratory center, meaning in our medulla oblongata. This controls the breathing muscles. And then know that in our pons, this is called the pontine respiratory group. So I'll write down here in the pons because they... Next, partial pressure. What does that refer to? It says here, in any mixture of gases, each gas contributes a portion of the total pressure. So what partial pressure really refers to? It says here amount of pressure each gas contributes, but what it really is that it's proportional to its concentration. So basically, partial pressure refers to the amount of the gas. So just as an example, and you do not have to know how to do this calculation that it shows here. It says here, what is the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air? So if the air has about 21% oxygen and the atmospheric pressure is 760, so here they just multiply the two numbers to get the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. And so again, partial pressure is just a method of referring to the amount of the gases in a mixture. And so partial pressure of oxygen, CO2, can affect the rate and depth of breathing. And it's also saying here the stretching of the lung tissue, emotional state, and physical activity. We're going to learn about these special receptors that look at the gas concentration or the partial pressure of gas. So we're going to learn about these receptors, these central peripheral chemoreceptors. And we're going to learn that the main controlling factor of breathing, regulation of breathing, depends on the concentration of CO2 in the hydrogen ions, but we are also going to see the peripheral chemoreceptors do look a little bit at the oxygen levels as well. Okay, so here first, central chemoreceptors. These are the special cells in our brain, in the medulla oblongata. And they look at the pH in the brain. So they're not actually looking at the oxygen level or the CO2 level, they look at the pH. So what is the connection between gases and pH? Let's look now. So low blood partial pressure of oxygen does not really affect them. Hydrogen ions do not cross the blood-brain barrier very well. And so what this refers to are those veins surrounding our brain. They don't allow the hydrogen ions to cross over. But CO2 does cross the blood-brain barrier. And when CO2 crosses, it likes to attach to H2O. And when it does that, it produces this H2CO3. This is called the bicarbonic acid, the carbonic acid. Then this carbonic acid separates. That's what dissociate means. It separates and releases the hydrogen ions from it. After it releases the hydrogen ions, it becomes bicarbonate. And so it's these hydrogen ions that are being detected by the central chemoreceptors. So therefore, since the hydrogen ion concentration is directly linked to that of CO2, these two substances are thought of as equivalent. And so increase in CO2 or increase in the hydrogen ions, because they go together, in the blood leads to increased breathing. Chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are also found in the arteries. These are called the peripheral chemoreceptors. And so it just refers to the chemoreceptors that are not in the brain, but in our arteries that are not part of the brain. And so these chemoreceptors can be found in the carotid artery, the aorta, as well as in the brain. If the partial pressure of oxygen is low, carbon dioxide is high, and hydrogen ions is high, then signals get sent to the respiratory muscles to increase the breathing rate. And so these chemoreceptors look at the oxygen levels, CO2 levels, hydrogen ions, and they send the signal up to the brain. And you can see on the picture the nerves are taking the information to the brain, and then the brain sends the information to your muscles to increase breathing. So again, as we saw on the last one, hydrogen increases when CO2 increases. And here is the formula that refers to that previous slide. The more CO2 you have, CO2 then attaches to the H2O. First, it forms the carbonic acid, but this carbonic acid doesn't like to stay in this form. It likes to separate. It gives off the hydrogen ions. So remember, the more hydrogen ions you have, the more acidic it is. And this is how we're seeing the connection. So more hydrogen ions, more acidic, and the pH is lower. Okay, so again, the more CO2 you have, the more acidic your blood is going to be. And then each time you exhale, you're getting rid of the CO2 and the H2O. Okay, so when you exhale, you get rid of both of those. You get rid of the water vapor and the CO2. When you're getting rid of the water vapor, you're also getting rid of the hydrogens from your body. And so if you increase the CO2 levels in the blood, pH decreases. If you decrease the CO2 levels, then the pH increases. Next, with the alveoli. Alveoli have actually these two types of cells. Most of the cells are made up of the simple squamous types of cells, simple squamous epithelium. But there are also these type 2 cells. Know that the type 2 cells are the ones that make surfactant. And know that the surfactant reduces surface tension on the alveoli to keep them inflated. Without surfactant, the alveoli end up just kind of wrinkling and closing up. And so it's not produced yet in the lungs of premature babies, but different medications can help to increase the surfactant production. Right, the difference in partial pressures causes the diffusion of O2 and CO2. If you remember, diffusion refers to going from high to low. And so this is what this picture is trying to show here. Alveolus, so the top part is the air sac. The bottom here is the capillary. And so we're seeing here the exchange of O2 and the CO2. So because over here, in the capillary, the blood is returning the CO2 back to our lungs. So here the CO2 is high, it's about 45. But in the air sacs in our lungs, there's less CO2. So that is why the CO2 moves from your capillaries into the alveoli. And then it's the opposite for oxygen. There's more oxygen in the alveoli because you just inhaled it. Less oxygen in the capillaries surround the alveoli, and the oxygen moves towards the lower concentration. And again, over here, we'll just underline this goes high to low. That's the important thing to remember. This slide is now talking about the effects of high altitude. At high altitude, the amount of oxygen is very low. As a result, oxygen takes more time to go into our blood, to diffuse into the blood. And this is called altitude sickness. So here the body is trying to increase the heart rate and increase the breathing rate in order to get more oxygen at high altitude. Also, more red blood cells and hemoglobin are going to be made. High altitude pulmonary edema is a severe form of altitude sickness, and some of the symptoms are stated here. So hypoxia means low oxygen levels. Low oxygen levels causes constriction of the pulmonary blood vessels. This then leads to the tissue fluid buildup or edema. And so I will explain this more in detail in the lab. Other disorders here, pneumonia. Pneumonia is just infection of the lungs. It could be caused by bacteria or viruses. The alveoli end up swelling as a result. Tuberculosis is a bacterial lung infection, know that. Here the lung tissue gets destroyed. and the atelectasis, or the lung collapse. So here the alveoli deflate and collapse. It's usually because the lung is punctured. Oxygen transport, two methods here. Most of the oxygen is carried, bound to hemoglobin. But a little bit of oxygen is traveling in the blood plasma. So oxygen binds to iron, that's what Fe refers to. Without iron, oxygen is not going to bind to hemoglobin. It needs that oxygen. And so there are 4 different parts for iron atoms in each hemoglobin. And so each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygens. Factors that cause the oxygen to jump off of hemoglobin, to detach from hemoglobin. Let's look over here. If there's enough oxygen in the area, let's write that down. So that's what this refers to here. Not enough oxygen in the area causes oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin to go to the low oxygen area. If there's if there's too much CO2 in the area, the same thing happens. Remember, CO2 is related to the acidity, so increased acidity also makes the oxygen leave, and high temperature. Then the released oxygen can go into our tissues. And so here, this is just a picture to show the diffusion of oxygen. Partial pressure differences is really what is driving the diffusion. Okay. After hemoglobin, meaning the red blood cells go circulate in our body and give off the oxygen to our cells, hemoglobin of our red blood cells is still about 75% saturated. It's kind of interesting. But of course, you want it to be a little bit more saturated at the end so that if you do physical activity, well, you do have still some oxygen there. As temperature increases, the amount of oxygen released from oxyhemoglobin increases. And this makes sense because temperature is higher by our tissue cells, because when the cells break apart the molecules, the nutrients, whenever you burn something, it releases heat. That's where the high temperature comes from. Next, CO2. Well, how does CO2 get transported? CO2 also diffuses into the capillaries, and this is also going high to low. We hear 3 ways that CO2 can be transported. Either the CO2 gets transported in the plasma, so similar to oxygen. Some of the CO2 gets binded to hemoglobin, and that's how it travels. But here's the third way, as part of a bicarbonate ion. And remember, we're getting the bicarbonates because here CO2 mixes with water in the blood. Then in the blood, so first that carbonic acid forms, which then separates. And here's where we see the bicarbonates. And so in our blood, we have a lot of this molecule there, swimming around. But really, it's disguised as carbon dioxide. And so this picture is just showing what we just said, carbon dioxide transport. Some of the CO2 is traveling in the plasma. Some of the CO2 is transported in the hemoglobin. And a lot of the CO2 gets transported as bicarbonate. This bicarbonate formation can occur in the plasma, but also especially this occurs in our red blood cells. There's a special enzyme in our red blood cells that facilitates the CO2 mixing with H2O to form the carbonic acid, and then the bicarbonate comes out. Okay, just another picture showing the transport of CO2. And this last slide just talks about what happens as we get older.